Welcome to Speaking Freely. For many Canadians, multiculturalism stands at the core of our national identity. It is often said, with some historical justification, that Canada is a nation of immigrants. And as Canadians, we pride ourselves on being welcoming to the next generation of newcomers. And of course, Canada's economy definitely needs immigrants if it's to prosper. We are, after all, a geographically vast land with a relatively small and aging population. So immigrants are core to our future. But talk to a lot of recent immigrants and concerns start to emerge that perhaps the Canada they live in doesn't quite live up to the one they had hoped for before they immigrated here. A recent survey by Leger Polling revealed a whopping 72% of recent immigrants surveyed said, quote, "Canadians don't understand the challenges immigrants face," end quote. Now, this was a survey that was accompanied with a news headline. New Canadian immigrants are more likely to believe that Canadians don't understand the challenges that immigrants face and feel that the rising cost of living will make immigrants less likely to stay in Canada. Amongst a younger immigrant demographic, that same survey revealed that 30% of new Canadians aged 18 to 34 and nearly a quarter of all university-educated newcomers said that they'd likely be leaving Canada in the next 2 years. Wow, that certainly doesn't bode well for a country that depends on immigrants. Now, while the high cost of living and difficulties accessing professional opportunities ranked high among their worries, author Lidia Perovich, our guest on today's show, has suggested that there are other reasons immigrants might be having second thoughts. In her book, Lost in Canada, An Immigrant's Second Thoughts, she suggests that for immigrants like herself, who were escaping countries where political and ethnic tribalism dominated discourse in daily life, that Canada's system of treating people as individuals first with certain enshrined civil liberties and freedoms was a breath of fresh air. What made Canada so great, according to Perovich, is that going to work or going to play was not about pledging allegiance to a political ideology or a singular way of thinking. In fact, you could go to work as yourself. And if you had differing political views or were apolitical, that was perfectly okay. So for immigrants that expressly left societies that commingled the personal and the political, what Michael Ignatieff once aptly described as blood and belonging, Canada's recent move over the last 20 years toward a more illiberal attitude on these matters has been quite troubling. Take, for example, the pandemic, when people were afraid to utter anything that seemed to bring up an individual's civil liberties. If, as if it was alleged, pointing out any individual right was akin to putting your fellow citizens at risk. Well, Perovich also decries the outsized influence that American political culture has put on Canada, particularly the radicalization and racialization of our politics. To quote Perovich, many people who grew up in a liberal democracy seemingly don't find it particularly interesting to defend anymore. The author points toward the dominant culture's preoccupation with narratives of strife and disintegration at the expense of more optimistic celebration of Canada's numerous successes. Through her writing, Ms. Perovich has managed to bring fresh insights into the discourse that Canadians are having that are often not centered around the recent immigrant experience. Now, although she doesn't shy away from aiming criticisms toward Canadian contemporary institutions, she also has advocated for a more positive vision of what liberal Canadian pluralism can bring to Canadians. Ms. Perovich is not shy about sharing her views, so join us after the break for what I can promise you will be a very lively and informative discussion. So stay tuned.
Absolutely, I have no doubt. It's a great country. It's always been and always will be. Yes, I travel a lot, especially after my retirement days. I know what's out there. Even before that, it's great here.
I definitely think so, yes.
Absolutely, yes.
definitely.
Yes.
Yes, I do. I think it's still a good place for immigrants to come and have a good life.
Oh yes, Canada is the right country right now to succeed and make yourself like calling this country home. So as I did 12 years ago when I first moved here, there is a lot of change, I have to say, but for sure Canada is a very dynamic and well, you have to adapt yourself to any situation, but I think it's a great country.
I do, yes.
Absolutely.
Economy, getting jobs, and if they have family, it's not bad because they help each other all the time. But I would say the economy is probably the rent, the whole thing that comes along with the economy.
I don't see them as much as they were when I came over. I don't see any difficulties today. There's a lot more for the immigrants, schooling, housing. No, I don't see any difficulties.
Housing, of course. Maybe that's a thing that's always been present for immigrants, validating their credentials, getting into the workforce with the qualifications they come in their places of origin.
I would probably say the support system of them coming to Canada and not understanding their language, and just helping them along to integrate into our country.
Well, I think integrating into the society, learning language skills, learning skills that are transferable into our economy.
I think that would be finding work, and not just work, but work that suits their educational level if they're educated. Sometimes it's hard for immigrants who have certificates or diplomas from other countries to find work in their field. I think that's a big challenge, and housing is a big challenge as well.
I think it depends where you come from. I have to say it's a very shock of culture, because I come from Europe, I'm Italian, so I'm very rooted in my traditions and habits that here you don't have it. So I wouldn't say the climate, everybody says it's too cold, but I think culturally you're gonna miss a lot of traditions, a lot of culture, unless you don't stick with your community, and I hope the community can do more to keep the traditions. Language can be a barrier, but nowadays probably everybody, the new millennials, the new guys, everybody speaks English. I learned from scratch, so I think I had to do that. Other than that, I think if you're willing to work and you adapt yourself, you integrate very well in the community, I don't see a lot of big challenges.
I think one of the main challenges is probably finding decent work. I mean, it's hard enough for Canadians to get a job right now with the economy and inflation and everything that's going on. So that makes it even harder for immigrants to get a job. I do realize, though, that there are certain facilities that do, they lend a hand with finding work or places of employment. But again, it's not always easily accessible. But I do think Canada does a really good job at welcoming immigrants and making them feel like this is the place to be.
Challenges, I would guess, finding work, and finding homes to stay at also, just because there's no homes for our homeless people, so let alone the immigrants that come.
Welcome to Speaking Freely. Today we have Lydia Perovich, author of Lost in Canada, An Immigrant's Second Thoughts. This is her first nonfiction book after having written 2 fiction books, and Lydia has a lot to say about Canada through the lens of someone who arrived here in the late 90s from former war-torn Yugoslavia. Now, Lydia, I want to thank you for coming on the show today. We started off the top with the mention of your book, Lost in Canada. Great title. I know you had a different title, which was?
What was Canada?
Right.
Meaning, what was Canada that I used to know, and something has changed in the last couple of decades.
That's exactly where I wanted to start. So what was Canada the Canada that you arrived to, and you can tell us that story. You came to study from, and I'm sorry if I used the term war-torn Yugoslavia, but that's a part of my own history. Growing up, we saw viscerally the images of what happened to your country, the breaking up of the country, and the effect it had. Obviously, you lived through some of that, and share that story with us that brought you to Canada, and then those impressions of Canada when you arrived.
Well, it was a tricky time. I mean, during the 90s, and it continues, unfortunately, to this day, hundreds of thousands of people have left the region. And it's a big retention problem with younger people and educated people in the region. Continues to this day because some of the problems persist even after the war. But I'll just list them: war in Slovenia, wars in Croatia, then longer wars in Bosnia, then a war in Kosovo, then NATO bombing of Serbia and Montenegro. So right after NATO bombing finished, I got a notice from Dalhousie University that offering me a scholarship to do my MA there, and I just jumped at the opportunity. In all honesty, I didn't know a huge deal about Canada. I had read Margaret Atwood. I have seen documentaries about her. I have seen André Melançon children's movies. I knew this and that, but I mean, I thought, okay, it's next to the US. I mean, how different can it be? But the longer I stayed, the more I learned about Canada, the more interested I became in it. And it's kind of an impossibly looking project of sort of transcending all our regional differences and all our ethnic differences and religious and linguistic differences and differences in opinion, to form a sort of a society, what I call in the book the great solidarity. I think the word nation, the concept nation, is still useful, and it should be useful for us, because it's a great solidarity between all us, among all us, and also with the past and with the future that we want to have. So what was interesting about the Canadian project is it was agnostic about ethnicity.
Yeah,
it really didn't matter, but that of course has changed recently, and it also was more optimistic about the sort of what we now see as the divide between settler and indigenous. We now see it as almost irreconcilable, starting from smaller gestures like a land acknowledgement and onwards, to now we advertise, for example, positions for writer in residence. I recently seen writer in residence ad that says open to Canadian writers and indigenous writers.
As if we're different people, right? Yeah.
There's some notion now here that there's this big thing that we cannot bridge. Whereas Canada, that I did gladly move to and join its project, had different plans. There's certain pessimism now about the Canadian projects that we seem all to be sharing.
And this is important because to a person who didn't arrive when you did, who didn't have a different life experience as you saw in Yugoslavia, the dissolution of your country along ethnic, linguistic, religious lines, you saw something in Canada that dampened down those differences. In fact, did the opposite, showed the unity, the commonality of someone living in the eastern part of Canada, Newfoundland, with the west or the north. There was actually a project to, yes, acknowledge cultural and ethnic differences, but not kind of bring them to light as sources of division, but rather sources of unity. That's something that you could see coming from abroad. What do you think that's happened to Canadians to make us not realize that that's kind of what's happening?
I think we've become, I think, especially exacerbated in the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, COVID and the lockdowns have and the pandemic, and of course, the social media have exacerbated a lot of these tendencies. But I think we've now become obsessed with race, which I think is completely new for me. I mean, maybe Americans like to see themselves as always having a conversation about race. I don't think that's very productive, but if that's what they want to do, that's within their rights. But why would the rest of the world be talking about race? Race, the concept, its effects, its class underpinning, it's not as important in the rest of the world. Like, it's a relatively new concept. It's hugely important in the US, not particularly important in European countries. We are divided along ethnic. We hate each other on cultural lines, ethnic lines, all these differences, languages. We don't talk about race, really. It didn't. I mean, we had bad periods in 20th century when we did talk about race. And then look at the rest of. I mean, look at the war in Rwanda. It wasn't race-based genocide. Like, there's all these conflicts around the world that are definitely not about race, and a lot of societies which do not are not founded around the notion of the race. And I didn't think Canada was. But we seem to have imported all this or just lapped it up. I don't know what it is, but of course our own culture is changing and we're adjusting our own culture and cultural conversations to what's happening in the US, I think.
Right. So this story then that you brought to your book, which we're going to talk about more after in the next segment, but taking you back, what was it about then that early Canada, which to my mind, is halfway point of my own life, when you arrived 20 odd years ago, but still you saw vestiges of a Canada that's different now. Rather than sort of talk about what you've seen change, what was around in that early period that made you happy about your decision to come here?
Well, if you're from the historically eventful part of the world, you don't really have this thing called private life. It's a huge privilege. Like you always have to think about political issues. And up to the age of 25, it was all about, your life's all about politics. Who's getting power?
You mean
what they're doing?
Back in Montenegro and Yugoslavia.
Exactly. Who's on power? What's happening in the last election? Who's saying what in which talk show? What an ethnic group is doing that, like non-stop. And the window for private life, when you can shut all that off, is very narrow.
And you had to be mindful of what you said in
that too,
public and
yes,
even private
course.
Settings, because you never knew who was listening.
I will get back to freedom of speech, absolutely. But of course, we tend to forget this with people in wealthy societies in the last 50 years, that having a private life away, living in civil society, doing the bowling leagues, doing the thing, just visiting your family, not giving a hoot about who's going to be the next mayor. It's a huge, huge privilege. And I don't think we understand that. But if you come from other regions of the world. So that was one of the reasons I wanted to go. Okay, seemingly dull country, but being a dull country is a huge thing. It's something that you need when you come from the Balkans. You want dull competence, basically. You want, people who are passionate privately, but don't necessarily put those passions into the public forum. And of course, I was attracted by just standard liberal democratic ideas like freedom of speech, which just was not that contested in Canada until maybe five years ago, when somehow the meaning-making institutions like the universities, the public schooling, the artists, artistic organizations, media even, I know writers, somehow decided that freedom of speech is not the most important value. There are other values that should supersede freedom of speech. And that's a big surprise to me.
So let's get there, because in February 2020, you wrote a piece in Canadian Literary
Review of Canada.
Right, Literary Review of Canada, your prestigious journalist outlet, that basically argued freedom of speech is the backbone of all these other liberties and virtues that we enjoy in Canada, but that it was under threat. You felt then. Can you tell us about what made you write that piece on the eve of the pandemic, when more of those liberties were put to the test? What drew your attention to that? And discuss, as you said, this erosion of belief in freedom of speech.
Well, I didn't think I would see people petitioning and protesting in front of libraries for carrying certain books. That was very new to me in 2010. I didn't think I would see unpublishing an op-ed from the Vancouver Sun, like mainstream media outlet. Also, some guy was asking whether we have too much diversity.
Oh, okay.
You can ask that for social cohesion. Of course, there are sociologists who studied this, whether massive amount of ethnic, religious, and so on diversity have the immediate effect of diminishing social trust. So that's probably the early, like long-term probably not, but early effect is probably, as we see in large global cities, the social trust is diminished.
And we see that also in workplaces. They talk a lot about diversity in teams, which was allowed to be discussed. Is too much diversity a problem or a benefit? This is more of an empirical question than a social one at the end of the day.
And another underpinning issue with that is that when people tend to hunker within their own ethnic groups too, when you have massive amounts of immigration. I mean, I can say this easily because I come from a small ethnic group. I'd probably play a different, maybe, hopefully not, if I like Chinese who would want to hang out only with Chinese, or if I was a Pakistani Muslim who would want to marry and date a Pakistani Muslim. But I don't think that's ideal. You don't want to live in that kind of a society when everybody's just ghettoized and, should I say, balkanized, basically.
Right.
So I've noticed in February 2020, so this is before the big Harper's letter that was signed by a lot of intellectuals in the U.S. that caused a lot of...
This is the Harper's Magazine letter that was sort of putting questions about what can be said and not said?
Yeah, and it was saying basically what I was already then saying in that piece, is that something's changing in the culture, and we shouldn't be deplatforming. We should platforming and arguing with the person you disagree with. We shouldn't unpublishing people. The publishing has changed. The book publishing has changed radically since then. So anyway, I did notice these things, and I thought this was a strange development. And I mean, we had a case. We had a feminist speaker who booked a room in a Palmerston library. There was like hundreds of people protesting her right to address. It was not hate speech. It was called, again, we're really quick now to call everything hate speech. So we had the city council doing a resolution about this feminist activist. How dare she say these words? And it reminds me of Politburo declarations. It was very, very strange. So anyway, I published that, and a lot of people were displeased. But fascinatingly, a lot of people in the media and in the academia.
Really?
And I mean, that used to be part of their job, to
protect
fight
free speech.
For freedom of speech and inquiry.
You mentioned, you had a term for that group. It was a very good term. You just used it. The meaning-making group, or the
meaning-making institutions.
Institutions. Yeah. That's a good point.
Yeah. Because we're secular now. Of course, fewer and fewer people are religious and would go to the church, or read religious books for the meaning. Right. So we actually go to arts, we go to books, we go to literature, we go to media. We open morning prayer is the opening of the newspaper, effectively. Right. And public schooling is where you make citizens. So in that way, they are sort of meaning making. But yeah, you can debate that.
So we're gonna move now to the more present day. In that intervening year, or 2 years, from the freedom of speech article that you wrote to the publishing of your book in 2022. It came out in spring of 2022. That period, you must have been affected by the events around you, probably accelerated your view that the tendencies that were coming into the society were in fact going to be accelerated during the pandemic. What did you see in that 2-year period that convinced you had to publish this book? And then we'll get into the contents of the book after the break.
Well, there was multi-pronged. It's the multi-pronged change, effectively. So these narrowing down of what's called the Overton window, narrowing down of what can be talked about, what can be platformed, what can be presented even, who can speak on behalf. It's a big conversation in fiction, who can create which ethnicity, characters of which ethnicity.
Really?
It was just extraordinary. It was conversation on the margins 20 years ago. Now that's almost the only conversation.
I mean, the idea is only people that have a lived experience can write about it.
Exactly. As if it's not fiction.
Then it stops being fiction, right? I mean,
so it's called fiction, people. It's on the book. It's on the box. It says fiction. Yeah. No, the fiction has different functions. I mean, if you want to write nonfiction, it's a legit question to ask. But fiction and art in general is a completely different ballgame. So that's one thing. And of course, we've all been confined to our screens for a couple of years, and working from home, and just see in other people vectors of illness, and it was very, very strange. So and then of course the COVID restrictions, of course, added to this strange illiberalization of society as well. I mean, European countries have dealt with it differently. I went to Montenegro a couple of times during the pandemic years, and it was, I don't know, there were always more pressing societal and political issues which somehow do not put COVID restrictions top of the priority. Right. And we've seen this with the George Floyd summer of crisis, and then some other demonstrations and so on. That how easily we just push the so-called science from the top priority of the orders, when something else pressing comes up. Right. So, I mean, in other regions of the world, there's always something more pressing. So you will never have like such strict regime of COVID restrictions in Montenegro, for example, as you'd had in Ontario.
That's a good observation. So this is funny. You left Montenegro, find more freedom of speech and thinking, and then you went back and saw there's sometimes ways in which our freedoms can be compromised by our own deficits. When we come back, I want to talk more about that aspect of Canadian society that's shifted and which prompted Lydia to write such an amazing book. Join us after the break. So welcome back. We're here speaking with Lydia Perovich, whose book, Lost in Canada, An Immigrant's Second Thoughts, is the focal point of our conversation now. So we were talking just before the break about how that February 2020 piece on freedom of speech caused some ripples because there were groups who had historically been advocates of free speech who had now begun to have doubts and second thoughts about whether this is the most important aspect of our society. You feel it is because it's the prerequisite to many other things. You're going to perhaps explain that to us. But before I get into that point, what was the main message that you wanted people to receive after they read the book, Lost in Canada? What was the impetus and also the goal and hope that that book what impact would it have?
As you know, it's a whole different, it's a number of essays about very different topics. But what I would want to ask Canadians is take interest in your own culture. That's number one. There's another thing that was different when I first came here. People were interested. We were reading, I mean, not always, but we were reading our own literature. We were watching our movies. Of course, Quebec more than anybody else.
No, but you're right. You just recalled. There was this fascinating Canadian success story. The History of Our Country was the #1 viewed show in the early 2000s. It was a multi-part documentary. They said no one's going to watch it. It blew through the roof, the ratings. You're right. People had a curiosity, an interest in our history.
Yes, history as well. And I mean, I look at the numbers now. Nobody, very few people read our literature. And that's another huge conversation that we have to have. I mean, I think Canada Council and various arts councils and ministries of culture should be very concerned about this. I don't think they are. And why this is happening. I mean, they're all now very political. I mean, you look at the Canada Council mandate now, it's completely political. I mean, imagine, this is what my publisher, Ken White, had a good joke about this, is imagine if the government is different. Imagine if Pierre Poilievre would want you to give a mandate to Canada Council. Like, if you accept it in one from one political direction, you're gonna have to, because the game changed, you're gonna have to accept it from the other political club. We're gonna have a TV series about the truck convoy or something. It's gonna be interesting.
So this is the point. The countries that people fled to come to Canada were that kind. With every political change, there was a change in the history, change in the narrative, change what you had to talk about in daily life. And you're seeing that as being an aspect of society that Canadians aren't realizing is happening because they don't have a reference point, perhaps, that's as recent as...
Absolutely.
Okay.
And there's trivialization of some very serious words, like genocide. I've seen genocide bandied about in conversation. I mean, even from our prime minister, was very careful not to use it in China, for example.
Right.
Trauma. Everything is trauma. Everybody's a fascist and Nazi. I mean, being called a Nazi on Twitter is just extraordinary for someone who lost a chunk of a maternal side of the family to actual Nazis.
Right.
And it's people are, just be serious, people. Be a bit more serious. But to circle back to my book, what you said, Canadians want to... I'd want us to have a look at our culture. I want us to go back to thinking about why are we here in this country? What are we doing here? What is our project? Stop worrying about what's happening in the streets of Portland or San Francisco or Washington, D.C. Like just look. And also, what stories are we telling about ourselves?
Positive ones. A return to that sort of, not negating the contested history we have.
Absolutely.
But find a positive goal that we can all strive to or agree with. And
if it's extremely bleak, nobody's going to tune in.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of this newer artistic production is extremely bleak and just irredeemable. And that's not going to work. That is not going to work. First of all, it's not true. It is not true. And then second of all, it's bad art. Good art is multi-layered, complex. Sometimes you're not sure what it left you with. Sometimes you're not sure what you're thinking about it. But it's not propaganda. Propaganda works differently. Which is not to say that some propaganda cannot be good artistically, but it's not what you want to do.
Perfect point. That you took the words out of my mouth as I was saying it, which is art leaves you with questions. Propaganda gives you answers. And that's a great point. I think it now dovetail with the other theme that I think is a subtext to all the different essays. And that's this idea of freedom, which has been now also made to sound as some right-wing platform.
I know.
When did that happen? So tell us why you believe that idea of freedom, individual freedom, our civil liberties, and the freedom to speak is so fundamental. Why is that the fundamental core value that you think supports the great society that we live in?
Yes. Wow, that's a big one.
I know, I'm sorry, I left you with a big... We have time, so you can answer it in many different ways.
Everything else, all the other so-called liberties become meaningless without the freedom of speech, thought, and inquiry. They become... Do you have really freedom of association if you don't have freedom of speech? Do you have freedom of scientific inquiry? Do you have freedom of media? Do we have transparency without freedom of speech? Basically, everything is undermined if that is gone. And somehow everybody's shrugging their shoulders, fine, let's unpublish, let's self-censor, some people will be offended. Let's not have that conversation. Whereas having the conversation, that used to be the Canadian way, I think.
Well, let's play devil's advocate. What if that speech is harming? The idea, we always said, this is the cliche, you can say anything you want, but if you shout fire in a crowded theater, you are causing harm and your speech is limited by what you affect on others. What people are saying is that this speech that we're trying to control is exactly that. You're shouting fire in a cinema. What do you say to that?
That metaphor is overused for all the contexts in which it shouldn't have been used. Another important distinction is not to forget about is violence is violence, words are words. I mean, you can be offended, but physical violence is a whole different thing, as people from other parts of the world will tell you. Will tell Canadians that violence is violence. So somebody who's really never experienced violence can tell you, you're disagreeing with me or using that particular word or misgendering me or calling my ethnic group that or something is violence. I think you should find a better way to approach it. Violence is violence. I mean, and then fascism is fascism. That word already has a meaning.
Right.
And should not be trivialized. Again, genocide is genocide. Cultural genocide, I don't know if that's a thing that exists. But
well, here's where the pandemic comes in. Because you're right, you kind of accelerated your program to get this book off into Canadians' hands, because I think you saw disturbing tendencies during the pandemic. Again, under that view of speech that can be harmful, people self-censored, people were made to do things they would have otherwise not done, not voice concerns. What was it about that period, do you think? Was it the fear that entered society? And once the fear leaves, do you think now we'll be less reticent to allow people to stifle speech? Or can it be that we get stuck in a particular path that can't be undone? Which of these two paths do you think will go? Did the pandemic permanently enshrine this fear of speech? Or maybe has it made us say, with second thoughts, hey, we went too far?
I hope not. I hope that's not what's going to happen. I mean, I had a big worry about performing arts because, as you know, I covered performing arts, especially live music,
for 10 years.
And that was all gone. That was all gone. Not in Europe. In Europe, a lot of people clamored for it. There was various countries. They were allowed to rehearse. Not everything totally shut down. A lot of European citizens just demanded, and of course we've seen that in Quebec in their theater scene. They really didn't want their theater to die. Like, no, you're not total blackout. We need something, right? In Ontario, especially in Toronto, my impression was nobody was
arts. No one fought for the arts.
What happened is somebody cleverly lobbied for the film industry with the Ontario government. So it got a special dispensation like an essential industry.
Right.
Because it hires so many people.
I saw this in my own university. We were closed. The university was open, filming.
That's it.
There were fake students in the seats rather than real students.
So somehow, I don't know who got an in with Doug Ford, but they got what they wanted, and the film artists have been worked through the pandemic. Yeah. Why not theater? Nobody knows. There was constantly whenever you had something live happening in opera and classical, you were constantly testing, like super strict protocol, and yet nothing happened. So I was worried about that, and but my impression now is that a lot of it is back with vengeance. The question is whether the audiences are back with vengeance or whether we're going to be very careful about going out, mixing with crowds. And I mean, every performing art it has a component of that, unfortunately. You don't have to rub elbows with strangers. And they may be vectors of illness. They have been. They might have brought you flu in 2019. So that's... I don't think we're kind of become too risk averse, but I hope I'm wrong. I hope the tickets will bump back up.
Okay, so that's interesting. So the fact that the arts were considered something as essential as buying your food in Europe allowed them to stay open. So this comes down to value judgments in the society and where we put our priorities. And you quite rightly point out Canada's not monolithic. Some regions did some things different. Quebec And Central Ontario obviously took a different path.
Interestingly, Saskatchewan had their symphony orchestra performing much more than TSO.
There you go. There you go. Saskatchewan, home of culture and art. Why not?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So this period then, from your mind, is still debatable which way it can go. But do you think, in your kind of response to the book, because you can speak to that, there were times when certain outlets have refused to publish elements of your book, others have covered it, of course. Do you think what you're saying now, I know it can resonate as speaking from someone who's a children of first-generation immigrants, whose stories about their own history, in my case it was the Spanish Civil War and my father's experience through it. When I read your book and your history, it resonated with me, even though we're not from the same parts of the world and we just happen to live in the same country at the moment. Do you think that that's the part that's missing, that people aren't understanding, especially in the mainstream Canadian culture, we'll call it, this identification now with the American view of society, which is race-based, white and other. This is not what Canada is about. Canada is a very rich history, ethnically, from its founding principles. It was two nations, French and English, in addition to the First Nations. We had these linguistic differences, these cultural differences. Why are we now simplifying the world into this white-black mold? Do you have an answer for that? Is it just as simple as America and its intrusion into our society, or is it something deeper that's happening, as you said, even in other countries?
Well, there's several different things probably. There's this mini industry, not mini anymore, I guess, EDI industry.
Right.
And
This
there's
is
a lot of people making
equity, diversity, and inclusion.
Inclusion,
Yeah.
training. So you'd have these diversity management coming into your workplaces to teach you how to respect people you already work well with. It's very strange. Then some people they're brought in to tell you you need to hire more this ethnicity, this and this. So that's how we now have job ads that specify, no, this, we just want a black person. This is the new phrase, black identified and indigenous identified. It's completely open to abuse, of course.
Right, right.
So this is how we see these job ads now, completely liberal. Like, when is it okay to specify? I mean, you can have your internal policy thinking about it. We need to increase ethnicity X if that's your goal.
Yeah.
But to put it in put in a job ad, like completely, and
So
nobody's contesting it. Interestingly,
in your mind, that's very illiberal,
Yes.
and I would tend to agree. The funny thing you mentioned about you're getting training to learn how to work with people you're already working with. I grew up in the East End of Toronto, a place called Scarborough. I go, that was my EDI training. You know, you're growing up with people from every background, every ethnicity. That's the Canada that I grew up with. So this is interesting. When there's an incentive, though, to import or bring in an American-style lens on our culture, then there's a propagation of it as a problem because you have a solution and you're making money from it. That's interesting. I've not heard people, at least in Canada, mention that as a potential reason we're seeing so much of it. But what about the cultural elites that aren't benefiting but are still proposing it? Why do you think it's hitting them? It's
interesting. I wonder how the institutions, the cultural institutions, have been captured so fast. And I'm thinking, it's got to be the very vocal minority and the very silent majority of people who are just
You've written about this, yeah.
waiting to retire, or you just want to be a nice Canadian. Like, okay, I'll just put the pronouns in my bio, although I don't know what it means. My signature, I'll just come out. I'll start the meeting with saying my ethnicity. It's very, very strange practices, just so we can get along.
Go along to get along.
And I think that's how institutional capture happens. Like a few really vocal, ardent people, and a lot of us just we just do want to make trouble. Let's just let's just not rock the boat. And so that sadly, that's how totalitarianism happens. Like a lot of people just shrug their shoulders. Oh, this can't be. This is not serious. This is not dangerous. Let's just have them their EDI, mandatory EDI trainings and things like that. But it's interesting what you asked. I'm just going to add this one thing. I've noticed this in the media. I mean, a lot of people are now making, like, you have columnists about race.
Oh, right.
You can earn a lot of money if you write about how bad the racial situation in Canada is. I mean, I'm a part of various minorities who have been oppressed in different ways. I don't want to make a career on it. Like, I mean, what kind of a life would that be if you write only about that? I mean, I could write only about how, like a short woman, I feel endangered in the world with big men. Mostly, any of them could beat me up, basically. Would you really want to write about that? I mean, come on, come on. So, there's a lot of crass careerism, is what I'm trying to say in this.
Crass careerism, small minorities with vocal agendas, and a silent majority that sits back. we can't forget it was a small group of Bolsheviks that took over the largest country in the world. Anyway, on that note, which is both hopeful and scary,
cheerful, yes.
hopeful and scary, but at the same time making us aware, I want to thank you again, Lydia,
so
for
much.
joining us today. And I recommend everyone read Lost in Canada, a fabulous book and a great window into our own society from someone who came here 20 odd years ago, but who sees things that most of us are oblivious to. Thanks again. We'll be right back after the break.
Look, I'm not racist, I'm not prejudiced against people that don't have schooling, but I would think maybe with some school degree to come here that we can use them. They're already half educated, just have to learn the language and finish their courses here, because we know that not all courses are accepted here except from England, maybe Switzerland. Other than that, you have to start all over again. But if they are already half educated, it would help us and the whole society as a whole.
More information before they even, as they make the decision to come over, provide them with more information. That's what I would think. Give the young ones the best chance that we can. When I say the young ones, I mean the ones who are in the beginning of the school, beginning of their lives. That's what I would suggest.
In the programs, bridging programs. When you land here, you have no idea where to go or who to talk to. So I guess a little bit of, more research, asking people what they really are about, what they expect, and what their history is.
Yeah, I think our number one is the resources to help, the resources that are provided and how they integrate into society with, even as simple as where they're staying when they get off the plane, where they're getting clothes for winter when they're come from maybe a different climate, things like that.
Well, I think we need to be more selective in our immigration policy with those who have the skill sets around the world. And, there's 300 or 400 million people around the world in transit currently trying to get to Canada. I think Canada has room to grow, but we have to be absolutely more selective in who is coming to the country.
I think that would be to have affordable housing, first of all, and then to open up things like nursing or the medical field or other fields even to educated immigrants.
I mean, I suppose there's things they can do. There's always ways to improve governments, right? But again, I don't know the details and the specifics.
What has been done? Probably the long waiting. I have to tell you the truth. For me, it was an easy process to move to Canada because I was born here. And I was 2 years old when my family moved back to Italy. So I'm Canadian. And I don't need any paperwork to actually move in this country. But for a lot of my friends who moved here, there is a long waiting. The process in the office, it's too long. It's complicated, and I hope government will look after this. I understand that back in the days, immigration was more controlling people moving country, but nowadays with the globalization and internet, I don't think we should go through all this process. I think everybody should be a citizen of the world and be able to move from country to country.
Welcome back. So that ends our episode on whether or not Canada's immigration and multicultural friendly society is in need of a reboot. Now, I'm a second-generation Canadian who grew up in an ethnically diverse East End part of Toronto. But I hear my own family's journey echoed in the words of Ms. Perovich. You see, my parents left Spain during the Franco-era dictatorship in the aftermath of a horrible civil war that tore up their society. They wanted to immigrate to a country where religious and political ideologies were not imposed on their citizens' personal lives. So it was heartening to hear someone as informed and eloquent on this topic as Ms. Perovich to speak on these same concerns and issues. Look, immigration has and will continue to be one of the most important issues facing Canada in the 21st century. And it's to our benefit as informed citizens to understand the experience of these recent immigrants much, much better. The freedom to express one's point of view is a value we should all cherish. And equally important is the need to be able to live one's life free from political dogmas imposed on us by others, particularly in the workplace. Ideologically based constraints on our freedoms need to always be evaluated to identify if those telling us what to do and think are making decisions in our collective best interests or to perhaps benefit some other political or economic agenda first. I hope our discussion with Ms. Perovich has caused you to reflect on your own vision of what Canada should and could be, especially as we exit this transitional post-COVID era toward a more uncertain social climate. So thanks for tuning in, and I hope to see you again soon.